Sit down, Michael, you've already embarrassed yourself enough. My brother-in-law Tyler sneered, loud enough that the laughter at the long Christmas table froze for a beat before bursting into a chorus of awkward chuckles, the silverware clinking as eyes darted toward me. And I caught the sharp glance from my teenage son who had been watching me all evening, as if I could shield him from every cruelty in the room. But instead here I was stripped bare in front of family, colleagues, and neighbors who had come over after church for eggnog and roast turkey, all of them witnessing me being cut down in the one place I swore I'd stand tall. My name is Michael Carter. I'm 43 years old, born and raised in Dayton, Ohio, and though most people see me as a man who's done well enough, a decent job in construction project management, a mortgage that sometimes feels like a chokehold, a marriage I keep patching together, I know something they don't. Something that hums in the back of my mind like a hidden current. I've been holding on to an advantage, a lever of truth and proof I never wanted to use, but if tonight pushes me far enough, I might. What's the matter, Mike? Tyler leaned back in his chair, his plaid shirt stretching across his smug chest. No comeback? No clever story about how you used to be the star quarterback? Or is that all gone like the promotion you didn't get? And the table rippled with forced smiles, my mother-in-law coughing into her napkin, my wife Emily staring at her wine glass as though drowning in its red surface. I gripped the coffee mug in front of me, the plain white diner-style one my dad always used for his morning brew, the same kind I kept as a reminder of simpler years before the world became a negotiation of pride and bills and betrayals, and the ceramic felt like an anchor, something ordinary yet unbreakable, something I could wield as a symbol of what lasts even when families fracture, and as I lifted it slowly, my eyes met Tyler's. And though I said nothing, the silence itself was a blade. He smirked at that silence like he'd already won, like the quiet meant surrender. But in my chest, the pause carried weight sharper than words, because I knew every laugh that echoed in this house would come back around. Each one recorded in the little vault of memory I never stopped curating, and I could see the twitch in Emily's jaw as she shifted uncomfortably, as if she wanted to defend me but was terrified of disrupting the fragile order her family demanded every December, and the smell of pine and cinnamon seemed to press against my lungs until I forced a breath, forcing my voice steady. Funny thing about memories, Tyler. They don't fade just because you want them to. And I watched his brow crease for a flicker, quick as the flick of the Christmas lights strung around the living room window. Oh, please, he fired back instantly, leaning forward with that performative arrogance he wore like cologne. Memories don't pay bills, and they sure as hell don't fix your track record. And the table laughed again, though not as loud this time, and I felt my son's eyes burn on me, pleading for anything that would show him his father wasn't broken. I reached for the breadbasket, not to eat, but to move, to do something with my hands so they wouldn't tremble, and as I tore a piece apart, the warmth of it in my fingers, the smell of yeast and butter, I thought of how even bread was fragile, its crust cracked under the smallest pressure, and I whispered almost to myself, "Some things break easy, others don't." And I knew he heard because he stilled for the briefest second, confused at whether I threatened him or pitied him. A chair scraped on the floor at the far end of the table, Uncle Frank rising with his beer belly, stretching his sweater, muttering, "Christ, it's Christmas, knock it off." But no one really stopped, the tension only thickened, and Tyler's smirk returned. Uglier now, like he'd sensed Emily's silence was his shield, and he went in for the kill. Leaning closer and lowering his voice enough that only a few of us heard, "You're not man enough to stand up for yourself in your own house." The words dug deeper than the laughter ever could, because they weren't just a jab. They were a public stripping, a blade turned slow and deliberate, and though I wanted to slam the table or shout, I forced myself to sit with it, because sometimes silence is the only weapon sharp enough to cut twice. Once when it lands and again when they realize what it meant. But my son shifted in his chair, his foot kicking the leg of the table by accident, his face flushed red like he was the one being shamed. And I couldn't let that linger, not in him, so I leaned forward at last, close enough that Tyler smelled the coffee on my breath, and I said evenly, "A man doesn't need to shout to prove he's standing." And though the room went quieter, his laugh tried to fill it again, brittle, overconfident, covering the fact that he hadn't expected pushback. Emily's sister Claire leaned in to whisper something to her, the two of them pretending the turkey needed basting again. And from the corner of my eye, I saw one of the neighbors, Bill from across the street, subtly raise his phone, pretending to check a message but really recording, the faint reflection of the screen catching in the chandelier light. And I wondered if he was waiting for fireworks or if he'd already chosen his headline. Tyler noticed too, and instead of backing down, he went louder. Hear that, everybody? Mike thinks he's some kind of silent warrior now. And the kids laughed even though they didn't understand, and the old Christmas record on the stereo clicked as if even the vinyl didn't want to spin through this moment. I pressed my palm flat on the mug again, feeling the heat that had faded to lukewarm, and I thought of how coffee cools faster than you expect, how it betrays you the second you think it'll stay warm. And in that thought, I felt the smallest crack in my restraint. I started to open my mouth, ready to say the one thing I swore I'd never say aloud in this house, but then the front door creaked open with a cold rush of air, and every head turned toward the shadow stepping in from the snowy porch. The gust carried in the bite of December and the scent of smoke from the neighbor's fireplace, and into that threshold walked my cousin Ryan, late as always, stomping snow from his boots, grinning with a six-pack dangling from his fingers like he had no idea he'd just walked into a storm already breaking. And Tyler seized the moment, calling across the table, "Perfect timing, Ryan. You just missed your boy Michael here trying to grow a spine." And laughter ricocheted again, some relieved, some cruel, but Ryan froze, eyes flicking from my tightened jaw to the shifting glances around the table, and he said carefully, "Didn't miss anything, looks like," setting the beers down with deliberate weight, but the damage was already folded into the fabric of the night. I swallowed hard, the taste of bitterness stronger than the wine I hadn't touched, and I wondered how long it would take before Tyler's need to dominate bled into something worse, something that would stain this holiday beyond repair, and in that wondering I almost forgot that advantage humming in the background, the one no one here could guess, the ace I kept tucked away not as a weapon but as insurance. And I felt it pulse again, like a secret heartbeat. "Spine or no spine," Tyler muttered, loud enough for Ryan to hear. Mike still lives in that same house he can barely keep up with man's drowning in bills and acting like he's king of the castle. And I felt Emily flinch this time, her hand tightening around her glass, and I wanted to scream that loyalty meant not letting wolves tear at your partner in public. But instead I forced a laugh, hollow but sharp. Better to drown in my own castle than beg for a room in someone else's. And for the first time the table hesitated, as if they weren't sure who'd scored the blow. Ryan cracked a beer open, foam spilling onto the table, and he muttered, "Damn, that stings." But before the edge of victory could reach me, Tyler leaned back and raised his phone, his thumb swiping and his smirk widened. "Funny thing about castles, Mike, sometimes the walls are just screens." And in that moment I knew he was about to show them something, and the blood drained from my face before he even turned the screen toward the table. The screen's glow lit his face like a campfire, hungry and theatrical, and he angled it just enough for the table to see while keeping it tilted, so I had to lean forward, my pulse hammering, and then there it was, a screenshot of a group chat, my name highlighted, words pulled out of context from late nights at the office, when I'd vented to a coworker about money being tight, about Emily spending more than I thought wise, about wondering if I'd ever climb higher than middle management. All the small confessions a man only makes when he thinks the room is private, but here they were, dragged into the light. "Looks like our big man Michael isn't so big after all," Tyler said, each word dripping with relish, and the gasps and muffled laughs spread around the table like a spill no one wanted to clean. Emily's knuckles whitened around her fork, her eyes fixed downward as though she'd been gutted by the revelation more than by the words themselves, and my son's mouth dropped open, not at the text, but at the betrayal in how it was exposed. "That's low, Tyler," Ryan said quickly, his voice firmer now, but Tyler grinned. "Low or just honest?" Guy talks behind his wife's back, behind his family's back, and we're supposed to pretend he's some pillar of strength? And though no one outright cheered, their silence granted him the stage. I wanted to rip the phone from his hand, smash it into the gravy dish, but instead I let my voice cut softer, steadier. Funny how a man's weakest words look sharp when stripped of the hours, the exhaustion, the grind that carved them. And I looked at my son when I said it, not Tyler, because some truths are only meant for the blood that will carry them forward. For a moment the house seemed to still, but then Aunt Linda broke the silence with a shrill laugh. "Well, that's Christmas for you, airing dirty laundry," and the spell shattered into nervous chuckles again. Tyler leaned back smug, pocketing his phone, but I caught the tiny flicker in his eyes. The one that said he hadn't noticed the faint reflection of the chat, mirrored perfectly in the glass window behind him. Ryan's phone tilted subtly upward to capture it. Ryan's thumb moved casually as he locked his screen, pocketed the phone, and reached for the mashed potatoes like nothing had happened. But I saw it, The deliberate calm of someone who just secured ammunition, and though no one else noticed, my chest tightened with the knowledge that Tyler's cruelty had just written his own obituary in real time, only he didn't know it yet. "Guess that's that," Tyler said smugly, raising his glass like a toast. "To honesty." And a few clinked back half-heartedly, though their eyes betrayed unease because no matter how you dressed it up, humiliating blood in front of family at Christmas left a sour taste. My father's old mug sat beneath my palm still, its rim chipped, its body scarred but solid, and I whispered inside my skull, a line that had carried me through nights I thought I'd never crawl out of. "A cracked cup still holds the heat if you grip it tight enough." "To honesty," I echoed, my voice steady but low, and the table quieted just enough that the words seemed to hang longer than they should have, like a shadow no one could ignore. Tyler rolled his eyes, muttering, "God, always with the philosopher act." But before he could stretch the moment further, Emily finally lifted her gaze, pinning him with an expression sharp as glass, and said evenly, "You don't know the first thing about honesty." And though her voice trembled faintly, the shot landed, Tyler blinking as if he hadn't expected her to step out of her silence. My pulse surged with a dangerous kind of relief, but I knew better than to show it, because wolves smell weakness in triumph alike. The old record flipped sides on its own with a scratch, filling the room with the crackling intro of a carol, and in the dissonance I caught the faintest vibration in my pocket, my own phone buzzing with a message, and when I glanced at the screen, I saw Ryan's text. "Got it all, crystal clear." I slipped it back without breaking expression, because the war had shifted, even if the room didn't know it yet, and Tyler leaned in again, smirk returning like he'd forgotten the flicker of doubt, whispering, "Enjoy your crumbs, Mike, because that's all you'll ever get." I let his whisper rot in the air between us, pretending it hadn't pierced me, because sometimes the most dangerous strike is the one you delay. And as the chatter drifted back into safer topics, football highlights, the pie cooling on the counter, whether the roads would ice over by morning, I sat inside my own skull, mapping every exit, every entrance, every angle of the night. Because if a man is going to be gutted at his own table, he at least deserves the satisfaction of rearranging the knives when the butcher isn't looking. Emily slipped away toward the kitchen, her shoulders tense beneath her sweater, and I knew she wasn't just fetching more wine. She was retreating, calculating, trying to reconcile her loyalty to me with the fear of ripping open her family's fragile truce. Tyler leaned back in his chair, thumbs busy on his phone, no doubt texting his little circle about the show he thought he'd orchestrated, and the glow lit his grin like a bonfire that burned only for himself. I could smell the coffee in my mug growing stale, lukewarm bitterness rising from it, and I thought again of how quickly warmth abandons you when you take it for granted, and the philosophy slid out under my breath without me planning it. Respect fades like steam, it disappears fastest when you wave it away. Ryan caught my eye then, subtle, a half nod that said he was still holding the digital blade, and I steadied my breathing, knowing patience was my only shield. At the far end of the table, my aunt was retelling the story of how Grandpa once drove his truck backward down the driveway for a laugh, and everyone chuckled, but I couldn't help thinking how backward this whole night had turned, how the very family meant to anchor me was cutting the line instead. I started to rise, ready to follow Emily into the kitchen, maybe to salvage something of us in the privacy of linoleum and fluorescent light, when Tyler's voice shot out like a hook. "Where you off to, Mike? Running away again?" And every fork froze midair. The accusation slammed into me harder than if he'd thrown the gravy boat, and though the urge to bite back coiled hot in my throat, I forced myself to pause mid-step, pivoting slow, letting the silence thicken until the only sound was the faint crackle of the fire and the shuffle of someone adjusting their chair, and I locked my eyes on his with a calm that wasn't calm at all but the kind of stillness you feel right before a storm snaps the power lines. "Not running," I said evenly, each syllable measured, "just making sure my house still feels like mine." And though it wasn't loud, the weight of it pressed down on the table, drawing a few uneasy glances. Tyler smirked like he'd baited me perfectly. "Then sit your ass down, king of the castle." But his joke landed flatter this time, fewer chuckles, and I realized the tide was shifting, not enough to crush him, but enough to show cracks in the armor he wore like a second skin. Emily reappeared from the kitchen with a bottle of wine, her face set in that practiced holiday smile that was really a shield, and she poured a little too generously into her glass before saying lightly, "Maybe we could try talking about anything other than Mike for once," and though it sounded like a joke, the barb underneath cut clean. Tyler raised his brows, but before he could reload, Ryan clapped his hands together, too loud, almost theatrical. Who's up for a toast then? New Year's coming, clean slates and all that, and he held his beer high. Everyone else followed suit, glasses raised, the tension folding briefly into ritual, and I lifted my chipped mug again, its surface warm from the fresh coffee Emily had poured, and the bitterness kissed my tongue like a reminder. Survival doesn't taste sweet, but it keeps you awake. Tyler tilted his glass lazily, eyes never leaving me, and muttered just loud enough, "Some slates don't clean, cousin." And though no one else reacted, my chest tightened with the realization that he wasn't done yet, that he had another play ready, something bigger waiting in the dark. He set his glass down slow, tapping the rim against the table in a rhythm meant to draw eyes. And when he finally spoke, his voice carried that cruel stagecraft he thrived on. "Since we're all about truth tonight, maybe we should talk about what Mike's been doing at work." And the words landed like a fuse lit in a crowded room, everyone leaning just slightly forward, waiting for the explosion. My pulse thudded in my ears because I knew exactly what file he meant, what whisper he'd twisted into something foul. And before I could stop him, he lifted his phone again, scrolling with exaggerated patience until he found the email I'd once forwarded from my personal account to double-check numbers at home. An email flagged confidential, and he turned it outward, flashing the bold letters like they were proof of a crime. "Look at this," he crowed. "Company secrets, right here in our family inboxes, and Mr. Responsibility thinks he's untouchable." Gasps scattered like glass breaking, someone muttering, "Jesus, Mike," and the shame burned hotter than the fire beside us. But beneath that heat was a different fire. The memory of the encryption notice, the tiny footer that said unauthorized access tracked, the little clause I'd read and filed away months ago, knowing one day it might matter. My jaw clenched, but I forced my expression flat, only lifting my mug again, sipping as if he'd shown them nothing at all, and that restraint unsettled him more than anger would have, his eyes narrowing like he couldn't understand why I wasn't begging. Emily spoke up then, sharp enough to slice the air. "Tyler, that's not your email to read." But he cut her off. "It's everyone's business when Mr. Noble is hiding skeletons." And he tossed the phone onto the table, screen glowing, the evidence there for all to gawk at. I reached for it slowly, not to grab, but to spin it just slightly, angling it so the reflection of the glowing screen bled across the glass cabinet behind me, knowing Ryan's camera would catch the timestamp, the sender, the proof that Tyler had trespassed where he shouldn't. My hand lingered on the phone, my voice calm but cold. "Funny thing about walls, Tyler. They don't just keep people out. They also track who forces their way in," and the flicker of doubt in his grin told me he felt the ground shift beneath him, even if the others hadn't yet noticed. The room buzzed with half-whispered speculation, forks scraping plates nervously, while Tyler leaned back like a king who'd burned his enemy at the stake. But the truth was coiling around him tighter than he knew, and I could feel Ryan's eyes on me from across the table, steady, waiting for the signal. "So what's the jury think?" Tyler called out, raising his hands mockingly. "Family man or fraud?" And though a few chuckled, more shifted uncomfortably, unwilling to crown him as judge outright. My son stared at me with that look only kids can give, the look that asks, "Are you still the man I thought you were?" And I gripped my mug harder, the handle biting into my palm, whispering inside myself, "Every verdict is temporary until the evidence turns." "Careful, Tyler," I said quietly, my voice threading through the chatter until the table stilled again. "Sometimes the jury you mock is the one you'll beg for later." And though he laughed it off, there was a tiny flick in his expression, a shadow of doubt he couldn't quite smother. Emily pushed her chair back suddenly, the legs screeching against the hardwood, and she stood with her wine glass half full, her tone crisp. "This is done. You've had your fun, Tyler, but this family doesn't exist to make a spectacle of one man." He smirked, raising a brow. "Then maybe you married the wrong one." And the gasp that rolled across the table was sharper than the bite of cold air outside. Emily's face going white as porcelain, my son's fork clattering to his plate. The silence that followed wasn't just awkward, it was dangerous, thick, alive, and I realized in that instant that Tyler had overplayed his hand, the cruelty too naked, the mask of humor torn away. Ryan reached casually for his phone under the table, and I knew the capture was complete, the final piece locked in. I let the corner of my mouth lift in something that wasn't a smile, wasn't a frown, just a crack in the mask I'd worn all night, And I said slowly, deliberately, "Funny how walls record echoes, even when the speaker thinks they vanish." The words hung like smoke, curling into the rafters, and before Tyler could sneer again, Ryan cleared his throat and stood, lifting his phone high enough for the reflection of the Christmas lights to glitter across its surface. And with a tap, the dining room filled with his voice played back from the tiny speaker, Tyler's exact words. "Then maybe you married the wrong one." Crisp. Cruel, undeniable, followed by his earlier jeers about me being spineless, about me drowning in bills, every insult looped back in his own voice, dripping with malice. Gasps erupted around the table, forks clattered against plates, and even Aunt Linda's ever-present smirk cracked into shock. Tyler lunged forward, sputtering, "That's out of context." But Ryan's thumb swiped again, and now the screen glowed with the mirrored chat screenshots. Tyler's phone caught in the reflection of the window, his betrayal immortalized frame by frame. The table didn't laugh this time. They recoiled, shifting away from him as though shame were contagious. Emily's voice, sharp as icicles, cut across the silence. "You violated our privacy. You humiliated your own family, and for what? To feel taller at Christmas dinner?" Tyler's face flushed red, his bravado crumbling into sputters. He started it, always acting above everyone. But the words landed hollow, childish. My son's chair screeched as he stood abruptly, pointing at Tyler with trembling fury. "You're pathetic," he said, voice cracking but strong, and in that moment I felt both proud and terrified at how much of me lived in him. Tyler turned desperate, reaching for his phone, fumbling as if he could erase what was already seared into the digital bloodstream. But Ryan's grin was merciless. "Too late, buddy. Already backed up." The room rippled with murmurs, cousins whispering, uncles shaking their heads, and the sound was heavier than any verdict, a social exile forming in real time. I leaned back slowly, lifting my chipped mug once more, sipping the bitter coffee like communion, and murmured just loud enough, "Even castles built on lies collapse the moment you light a match." Tyler's eyes locked on me then, not with triumph anymore, but with the stunned realization that the crowd he'd weaponized had just turned into his jury and they weren't laughing with him anymore. Tyler's mouth opened and closed like a fish flung onto ice, his swagger drowned beneath the weight of his own words echoing back at him, and in that silence I stood, chair legs scraping deliberate and slow, every eye following as I circled the table to where his phone still sat glowing faintly against the wood. I didn't snatch it, didn't need to. I just set my chipped mug beside it, the steam rising from the fresh pour Emily had slipped into it moments earlier, the rim scarred but unbroken, and said softly enough that everyone leaned in, "Funny thing about cracks, they don't make you weaker. They make you honest. What breaks a man isn't the flaw, it's the lie he hides behind it." The words landed heavier than any shout could have, and Tyler shoved back his chair, muttering curses, trying to storm out, but the front door opened before he reached it. Two neighbors from across the street stepping in, pulled by curiosity and invited earlier for dessert, and behind them Bill, the one who'd recorded Tyler's first cruelty, holding his phone high. "Already trending," he said flatly, showing the screen where Tyler's sneer looped endlessly, the caption brutal in its simplicity. "Christmas bully gets exposed by family." Gasps swept again, but this time they weren't from me, and Tyler froze, realizing the humiliation he'd orchestrated had already metastasized beyond the house, beyond control. His empire of mockery turned to shackles. My son exhaled beside me, his shoulders finally dropping, and Emily slid her hand over mine beneath the table, her touch trembling but present, and in that fragile connection I found more strength than any defense could give. Tyler sputtered, "This isn't fair, this is entrapment." But even his mother shook her head, whispering, "You did this to yourself." He staggered toward the door, but no one moved to stop him. No one begged him to stay. And as the snow swallowed his figure outside, I lifted my mug one last time, letting the bitter warmth coat my throat. And I told the table, not gloating but steady, respect isn't given or taken, it's revealed. And once revealed, it never hides again. The words fell into silence, but in that silence was judgment, release, and the kind of lesson that lingers long after the decorations are boxed away. In America, your greatest strength isn't being flawless. It's surviving the cracks with your dignity intact while those who mocked you drown in their own noise. If this story resonated with you, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe. It helps us share more true stories like this.